Welcome, everyone. I can see the participants flowing in. We're so glad you're here to part 2 of our Dyslexia Awareness webinar series. Welcome. We're going to give us just a minute to fill the space before we get started with our hosts, Donell Pons and Kristen Killian. So for today's webinar, we really want you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to put your questions in there. That way they don't get lost. And then just a little heads up that for the chat, when you put a chat in, that's going to come to all of the panelists. So you can put something in there, and like if you need help with something, we can always help you in there. So we have Michael in Louisiana. Welcome. And everybody else, say hi in the chat too. We want to hear from you. Tell us where you're coming in from. Again, use the Q&A if you have specific questions about the content. I'm so excited. I think this is the most excited I've ever been for a webinar. I don't know about you all. If you were at part 1, I just left feeling so jazzed and empowered and passionate that we need to get this information out to more and more people. So we are going to get started. We're a little bit past the hour now. I do want to take a quick second to introduce you again to Donell Pons, who is a dyslexia specialist, educator, presenter, and writer who now works with adults with reading challenges. And Donell is the president of the IDA Utah chapter. And Kristen Killian is the Metro RESA Dyslexia Endorsement Co-Coordinator. That is such a mouthful. And serves as an endorsement instructor. She teaches literacy courses in the undergraduate and graduate programs at Kennesaw State University in the Department of Elementary and Special Ed. And Kristen serves as an expert literacy analyst for the National Council on Teacher Quality and is a certified P12 reading specialist. We are so honored to have you both here today sharing your knowledge with us. So I will turn it over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Jillian. We want to acknowledge, Chris and I both, what a great team we have working with us at Reading Horizons, who helps these slides look so fantastic amongst many other things. We appreciate it so much. And this is that part 2. So if you missed part 1, feel free to go back and take a look at that. And that was, we did mainly did assessment and that kind of thing, and then talked about also intervention. This one, we're going to focus in on life with dyslexia, support in school, work, and social spaces. And what we really want to focus in on, and we don't want to forget, is that even if you're an older student, because that's really my love and my passion is working with older students, it's never too late to get intervention. So even though we're going to be talking about supports, accommodations, a lot of those things, we're always doing it through the lens of, yes, but we also can teach folks those skills if they would like to learn them later when they have a choice. And so I will just move to the next one. On our agenda, we have 3 parts we're going to keep to: improving literacy at any age, barriers, resources, and support systems, and fostering supportive environments. It's kind of broken up into 3 parts. And we'll get started right away with this slide. I know, Kristen, you and I, we've talked about this before. We've seen lots of different things about folks who have dyslexia, and sometimes they like to throw up slides of lots of movie stars and really famous people who have dyslexia, and that's true. And then, entrepreneurship, is one that gets talked about a fair amount, that there's a lot of folks who happen to be entrepreneurs who have dyslexia, and that is true too. And what we want to remind people of is, because dyslexia is spread amongst the population, it's not linked to IQ. You can have a lot of folks who fall into different categories of where their emphasis is and what they like to do that have dyslexia as well. And that's something to keep in mind. Anything you want to add there, Kristen?
Yeah, I just think you said a really important thing, that it is spread across the population, right? So they're going to be everybody in every walk of life, just like a typical developer, right? I love this. I hear all the time about how the dyslexic brain is super creative and has to use that other hemisphere a lot, which maybe is like exercise for it, and it makes them even more creative and, you know, all the things that an entrepreneur needs to be. I also like to bring up Walt Disney. I was in Florida doing a learning disabilities conference, and I'm like, and Walt Disney, he was dyslexic too, you know. So it is interesting, and I think showing it in a webinar is one thing, but showing students is another good thing, right? To show them that, you know what, look, all these people, you're not alone. You know, it happens to a lot of people, and there's ways to have intervention and work around it.
Yeah. I think it's important too. I remember my husband, he refers to folks with dyslexia, he calls them scrappy. Refers to himself as scrappy and folks with dyslexia as scrappy because he said we had to be in order to get things done. You had to be scrappy in many circumstances. And so I also think that's kind of an interesting term to put with having dyslexia too. So
Yeah, I like it.
yeah, right? That's a good one. The reality of reading difficulties. We're going to take a look at some statistics, and some of these might be familiar to you, some might not. So this is one that Kristen and I referred to in the first webinar. 33% of all fourth graders are proficient or advanced in reading. That means the majority of students are not. And that's reflected here, that a third are below basic in reading. And when we talk about that below basic, that's really not a high bar to hold. So Dr. Louisa Moats a while ago did a report talking about just exactly what those levels mean. And so we should be very concerned when we see statistics that look like this, because it's not really a huge high bar that we're holding. And so that ought to concern us. 21% of adults in the US were illiterate in 2023. And that's not functionally illiterate, that's illiterate, to think about, that you don't consider yourself literate. And I have had the opportunity to work with many folks who fit into that category. So what that looks like is, because this is a couple of students that I've had, a few students, this looks like not being able to fill out any forms. So you always have to either take them with you or have someone else do it for you. So I want to go in for a job interview. If they have me write down anything, I can't read what's in any of those boxes and I can't fill them out. I can't go down and make a simple bank transaction because they're asking me to look at certain things. This is a deposit, and I have to read that out of the boxes. So when you really break it down and you have someone who tells you exactly what that's like every day, it's extremely limiting to think about that. And that is too high a number for sure.
Is an amazing reminder for us because, you know, we know that literacy is important, and we're like, oh, it's important work. Even before this, right? We were on the call and we're like, it's important work. But when you hear that, you really know that if you're an educator watching this, that you have the ability to change a life trajectory. That's huge, to change a life trajectory. And looking at that first one, 33%, that means 67% are not meeting that lowest bar. Right? Like you said, it's not a high bar. They're not meeting that lowest bar. And I said this in the first webinar, so I apologize for repeating, but if we have 2/3 of our students who just fall off the path, we should not just keep going on business as usual. So I'm super excited that we are seeing some changes and some movement across the country. But we really do have a chance to change life trajectories. And I love that you share that, you know, specific things about your students, because it's just heart-wrenching, but we can do something about it.
Yeah, because each one of those numbers is a person, right? These
Mhm.
stats are people. 1 in 4 children in the US grows up without learning how to read. So that can look like a lot of different things. We'll talk about that later. And 44 million adults are unable to read a simple story to their children. Boy, that really breaks it down for you, right? And so this also reflects back to some of those students that I talk about that never felt comfortable reading with their children. And these were students who had some form of literacy, wouldn't be considered illiterate. My students who considered and were not now, thankfully, illiterate, were never comfortable picking up a book, and oftentimes would talk about how much they passed off to their partner to do those things because they just felt so uncomfortable. Wouldn't even go into a school because they felt so uncomfortable. They might be asked to do something they knew they could not do. So think of the many ways in which this shuts down that whole dynamic of supporting your children if you don't feel comfortable enough to be in the places where you want to see a parent support a child and you want to support your child. So that is 44 million adults are unable to read a simple story to their children. That ought to motivate a lot of us right there. Right, Kristen?
It just makes me think that it's kind of compounding, right? Because dyslexia
Yeah.
has a genetic element. And when you can't read to your children, and then they may be struggling too, there's a chance that they are, then it's just a compounding problem. It's heart-wrenching.
And we have another set here. We'll kind of go through these quickly. 54% of adults read below a 6th grade level. 54% of adults read below a 6th grade level. I just really want you to think about that for a minute. So they statistically get through some of those statistics, but yet would you call yourself super confident and able to do whatever you would like to do, regardless of literacy level, if you're reading at a below a 6th grade level? I just want you to think about that, what that feels like. 20% of adults are below 5th grade level. 12th in a study of literacy outcomes out of 20 high-income countries. So the United States ranks 12th out of 20 high-income countries in terms of literacy amongst the population. And that just shouldn't be the case. We have way too many resources and information. 40 to 50% of folks who have dyslexia could have a comorbid condition. Top ones are dysgraphia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and a lot more. We're talking about developmental language delay, DLD. We're talking a lot more about that, and ADHD as well. So think about those comorbid conditions. So if we're not helping a student understand dyslexia and catching it early, like we can, because we can screen out, then they're not having the opportunity to say, I may be at risk of, or the parents be able to look and say, oh, this means that my child may be at risk of, so I can be aware to be looking for. Yeah, we don't give them the opportunity to do that if we don't talk about it. And $2.2 trillion per year is the cost of low literacy levels in the US. Yes.
That makes it an everybody problem, right? You know, it's not oh, I don't have kids or my kids are grown or whatever. It really makes it an everybody problem. And, you know, you think about the cost in public assistance for somebody who is illiterate, or, you know, incarceration. We talked about that a little bit in the first one, but it really is an everybody issue. And so even for people who are not passionate about literacy, maybe are passionate about where their tax dollars go and how they're used, you know, that Donell, you've probably seen that infographic that it costs a lot more to incarcerate somebody for a year than it does to educate somebody for a year. And so where should our resources be spent, right?
Yeah. So types of reading difficulties. We're just going to review this a little bit because it's worth making sure we've gotten the information so we can share. Types of reading difficulties. That's that quadrant that we're thinking about. Down the left-hand side there, we have word reading, weak, strong. And across the top, language comprehension, strong, weak. And you want to think about folks that you're working with, or if you're here because of family members or people you care about, think about where they might fit in these quadrants of types of reading difficulties or challenges. So if we have we're strong in both word reading and language comprehension, proficient reader. So that's a lot of folks who think, oh yeah, great, I've got the reading down. If you're strong in word reading, but weak in language comprehension, we start looking at hyperlexia. That's that bit where they say word caller sometimes to talk about it. They can decode and take the words apart, read quite fluently. However, when they get done, they're saying, I don't really know what I just read. And then weak in word reading, but strong in language comprehension. Think about our dyslexic students or the compensating profile. And that's because the decoding is the challenge. I'm not able to unravel the words. I don't have the ability to do that. I need the help to put that together. But my language comprehension is strong. So my oral language is very good. And in fact, when somebody reads me something, I can give great answers back. If I'm allowed to give a verbal response, it's terrific. If you make me write it, that's going to be a challenge. So that's fitting directly in that area right there. And then where word reading and language comprehension are both weak, then we're looking at a mixed reading difficulties. Could be a combination of things. And this, we're looking back at Goff and Tunner from 1986. They organized these 3 different types of reading difficulties under the Simple View of Reading framework, which have withstood the test of time. We're still talking about them. And a 4th being that compensator type. This is from David Kilpatrick, 2015, in his book, Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, a fantastic book. And Kristen, I'd add.
Yeah, all I want to say about this one is when I see this, I think it's good news.
Yeah.
Because with dyslexia, we have a formula. We know, you know, how to address word recognition difficulties, right? We know how to address phonemic awareness and decoding difficulties. Hyperlexic and mixed reading difficulties, a little more of a challenge in my experience to address those language based issues. But with dyslexia, we sort of have a recipe. We know what works. We just have to do it. So to me, I think it's almost good news to know that we have a plan, at least, how to help students with dyslexia or at risk for dyslexia.
Yeah. And it's nice to think about this too, Kristen, because it sometimes gives us clarity about some students that we find tricky, right?
Mm.
Taking it back to a simple view. Yeah. Improving literacy at any age. So that's the message, Chris and I definitely want to send is it's never too late. And you've heard me talk many times about the ages of my students. I've got a real big range of ages of students. And the only thing I make sure is to say, you need to want this if you're older, because now it's all on you. And so if you don't want to, we can do any kind of remediation you want to talk about. If it's, hey, set me up with a bunch of accommodations and things, find me some tech tools, help me kind of figure out my day. That's one level. If I still want, hey, no, I'd like to be a better reader. If I get confronted with something, I'd like to be able to pull that apart if possible. Can I do that? Absolutely. To students who say, you know what, I've had a dream to read a certain book. And I've had many an adult student come and have a book in mind that somebody gave them a good 20 to 30 years ago, or was read in a class and they didn't have the ability to participate and read with the class. And they just want to read that book. I want to get good enough to read that book. And so you set your goals where you want to set your goals. So improving at any age. And what do you think, Kristen? Help us with this one.
Yeah, so I just think this is also promising and good news, just like the
Yeah.
other side, that we can help students, what some statistics say 95% of students can learn to read with the right intervention. In this, we said that researchers reduce the number of children who require ongoing or, general or special ed remediation 30 to 3%. So it has to be the right kind of intervention, right? Not all intervention is created equal. So we talked a little bit in the first series or webinar in this series about structured literacy and all the elements of structured literacy and how important that is. So not all intervention is created equal. And then also just being hopeful is a good thing, but reminding educators specifically that hope is not a strategy, right? We actually have to take action and do things that we know will work. But it is promising, the things that we can do and the things that are coming to light and what we know.
Yeah. And Kristen, as you mentioned, I mean, we've replicated, so this particular research study, but it's been replicated and has the same results when we have great evidence-based resources that we're utilizing, and then we're correctly working with students. And it actually makes some changes, doesn't it?
Yeah, with appropriate instruction, right?
Yep, with
With
appropriate instruction.
Right, right. And it's so exciting, like we said before, now that we have functional MRIs that are safe to put on brains and actually see what's firing up and what's happening. I get so excited when I work with elementary teachers and I say, you're brain architects, you're literally brain architects. You are making synaptic connections happen. The brain is not wired, at birth to learn how to read, but for anyone, but we make things happen with appropriate instruction. So to me, this is super, super exciting that we can do brain repair. And I think it was Shaywitz who said this kind of intervention has startling results. So
Yeah.
again, promising.
And one thing we want to recognize, it's not easy. So just want to put that out there many, many times. It's not easy and it can get more challenging given different things. So how many years you've been, guessing and going and trying to get things done. So you have these habits that have built up and different ways of getting around things. That's a part of it. Another piece may be maybe I have a lot of comorbid conditions. It makes it really challenging for me. So it's not all the same for everyone. And results may vary amongst folks, but we know that we can, and we know that it takes a certain amount of effort. And I was just thinking of my husband, because he's a really good example to me. He would share with me in real time. That's why I often think of him, because he would share with me in real time what was happening for him. And it was after years of remediation, we finally got on the right thing, finally doing all the things. He really wanted it bad. And I remember one time when the orthographic mapping, what we just take for granted, I hear something, I hear a word, I'm writing it down. My husband stopped and just said, "Does this happen to you all the time?" Because I just had it happen. Those are remarkable moments, but that's what we're talking about, the difference between how much work it is for someone else, right? Right. Helping a severely struggling reader. Kristen, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, so this is right up my alley because I
Yeah.
love catching them early, through screening, and doing this early is what I'm hoping for. But like we said in the last slide, it's appropriate intervention and it is extensive. It's gonna, like you said, it's gonna take time. No person with dyslexia no two people are the same, just like in a typical developer. One thing that I would take away from this slide is that even though we assess for rapid automatized naming when we're screening for dyslexia, we can't really teach that. Right? Instruction is not going to directly influence that rapid automatic naming. But there are things in our control. So we do want to think about what's in our control, and that's working in those word recognition strands of Scarborough's reading rope. But again, the dosage, how often, number of minutes, using appropriate materials, using appropriate progress monitoring. It's not easy, to Donell's point, but it can be done with the right instruction.
Great. And teaching fluency. So this can be one of the most difficult or challenging parts, is to promote fluency among students. Teachers need to understand, we're going to say three things, but there's a fair number of things that go on, but getting to fluency can be very challenging. So one, integrate automatic word identification with other types of instruction. So Kristen, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, well, when we teach to automaticity, right, it frees up
Yeah.
that cognitive desk space for other things like comprehension, right? Our end goal, the product that we're trying to get to is comprehension, right? So when we teach those word recognition skills to automaticity, we kind of free that up for students to be able to do those other things, those language comprehension pieces.
Yeah, and so we want to make sure we provide opportunity to get there, right? That's part of that pacing for the student. Provide extensive practice in reading, repeated reading of the same material, phrasing opportunities, silent reading, etc. So lots of different types of opportunities with text, right, is the message. And this one, my husband, he's talked extensively, but I don't think it's something I should repeat many times because it was really interesting. He talked about how important it was for him to pick up little decodable readers with each of our children that came along. So we have 4, and he would start with the first little one, and he'd grab them in the evening and do the decodable reader with that child until that child outpaced him and would move on. Then he'd grab the next little reader and he'd do the same, and to get that practice where he needed to be, but it took a lot of practice, and grab the third reader, the fourth, and so on, until he was able to advance. And he was advancing. That's the thing too, is then he could circle back and pick up those first 2 readers that had gone on and outpaced him. But now his ability to read a text that was further advanced was higher as well. So he could pick up reading again with that student. That's a lot of practice when you think about it. So when you think about a child that's been denied those opportunities because they didn't have the ability to practice those skills, how many hours that was for a student. When you're little, you don't even think about it. You're getting that time with parent reading with you in the evening. It's all you're doing. You're getting a lot of reading within those grades, and that's not happening for you. You're losing out on all those opportunities. They've got to come somewhere, huh? And then this last one, Kristen, why don't you take that?
Yeah, so provide extensive reading of many different things, wide reading, and I would say too multimodal opportunities too now. We read on the screen, we read in lots of modalities, so that's really important. The only other thing that I always like to say about fluency, it's something I think Jan Hasbrook said, is that it's really a thermometer, right? Especially if you're teaching elementary or you're working with elementary students, fluency is a thermometer. It's an indicator that there is an issue or not, right? Just like if you have a fever, you don't know if you have strep or COVID or something else, right? Fluency is an indicator. It's like a thermometer. And so I would encourage you to do these practices, but also to dig deeper and find out what might be causing a student to be disfluent.
Yeah, absolutely. Digging beneath the surface. And then I also just wanted to add about that variety of text. It's so important. So again, as I mentioned with my husband, I think he's a good example. He starts out with the reader that's appropriate for what he's doing at that moment in terms of instruction, but then very quickly and at the same time, he's getting different kinds of text, right? So having an opportunity within those. The other thing we want to pay attention to is I hear this often, and I just want to put an end to it. I hear people say, well, the student isn't quite ready for other reads. And so what I do is just say, you have to be within this certain text. They can't have those other books. They can do audio. Absolutely. So my cute last child, very dyslexic. It took a lot of years of remediation, but he was exposed to a wide variety of text and was doing texts like To Kill a Mockingbird because he enjoyed it. And he's in the 4th grade, but he liked it. And he's listening to that on audio. Man, the comprehension, he's getting sentence structure, vocabulary exposure. And keep doing that for your student. Ear reading is reading as well. Yeah. Okay, types of reading practice. We've covered this a little bit, but it just bears repeating just for a minute. Repeated reading, we know, is a practice. We know that it's validated, but we're also hearing about the fact that doing reading in a lot of different text and open text is also showing some really good results within research studies too. I attended a couple of conferences where this topic has come up, and they're revisiting this. Hey, what about also open text? What they call open text, or getting into different types of text, also is bearing a lot of great evidence. The other piece that comes out of it is the oral aloud reading. That's another piece that is generally considered within a lot of research practices to be a really good activity to promote the fluency, to hear out loud oneself reading. And then also scaffolded reading. So that's where you've been given a certain set of prompts or things in order to help scaffold that read. We do it all the time as teachers, as educators. You know, it can be within vocabulary that you want to help a student with, but somehow you're scaffolding that read so it's more meaningful for that student. You're going to help them perhaps do some pronunciation of various words that come along, multisyllabic, and how we might take those apart and scoop them. You're scaffolding that read. Oral assisted reading, we know it's really good practice for students to hear a good reader as well. So we want all of our students to have exposure to hearing really well-read material, so they have a sort of role model, a mark in which to follow. And then independent reading instruction. Sustained silent reading, we want to be careful with that one. We want to make sure our students have the skill set before we ever put them with a text to do sustained silent reading. We also want to have some goals for the student when they're doing sustained silent reading so that their attention doesn't wander. So you might have some questions for them that they're going to answer, but make sure that also the sustained silent read has guide points to it to make it most valuable for the student, right, Kristen?
Yeah, especially I get a little bit hesitant when I see that sustained silent reading in elementary
know.
school, because you see those kiddos, especially the ones that struggle, they want a chapter book. Second or third grade, people are starting to have chapter books. So they'll just get a chapter book because they want to be like everybody else, even though, or, however many others, even though that might not be appropriate for them. Right. Or they'll just look, and then I've had students that just turn the page when somebody else turns the page. And so we have such precious little instructional time. We just want to be careful with that too. Yeah. I love the independent reading. That's where we can really close some gaps for students. Yep.
Absolutely. And barriers, resources, and support systems. We want to talk a little bit about what are some of the barriers to our students getting the assistance that they need, what are some resources, and what are some support systems. So this first slide, contributing factors limiting teacher development. So that might be one of the challenges to getting students what they need, particularly in those older grades where teaching someone to read was never a part of what you were taught as a teacher. Yet here you are with a classroom, given our statistics that we just shared with you, a classroom where you could have quite a few students who still need instruction in how to read. And so, Kristen, we have scientific journals that are inaccessible for a host of reasons, right?
Right. And let me back up just a little bit. We have fourth and fifth grade teachers, third, fourth, and fifth grade teachers are like, that's not me. That's the K2 teachers. I don't know how to do this. So really, if you miss the boat in K2, sometimes you're out of luck, but everybody's a reading teacher.
Yep.
Right? Everybody's a reading teacher. But yeah, so contributing factors, scientific journals are inaccessible. And not only are they inaccessible, most people are not taught how to critique research for whether it's valid and reliable. You can do a study on one person, and a publishing company can publish that study and say, this is research-based, or this is evidence-based. And we aren't really taught as educators to really get critical about research. So not only are the journals inaccessible, we don't necessarily know how to read them and critique them.
Right. And then there's also this one, limited time for professional development. As you said, there's precious time in a school, right? And you may not be receiving it.
Right.
And then the PsycInfo database, we had some statistics here. Why don't you tell us about those, Kristen, because it's interesting.
Yeah, so if you do a search, you're going to see this many results. And again, how do you know where to go with that many results? How do you know that a source is a good source? So it just compounds the issue of, if we're out trying to develop ourselves as educators, we're really coming up against a mountain and not knowing where to start. So that's why it's really important to advocate for quality professional development wherever you are, because one, we don't have the time to read all the journals, and then it's just so much that it's overwhelming.
Yeah. And what constitutes quality, like you said. So this leads us to give us a little help here, Kristen, with what we can
Yeah.
do. Right?
Yeah, so this is from MTSS for Success, which is a great website. But it's just a visual reminder that we are screening. Hopefully, wherever you are, you're screening in kindergarten, first, second grade, hopefully. And then progress monitoring is a big piece. Lots of times schools will maybe screen and then they don't know how to appropriately progress monitor, right? If your student's on a tier 2 or tier 3, how often should you progress monitor? What kind of data should you be collecting? Is the data the same as your interventions? So you really, even if you're unsure about that, the best thing is to try, right? And see what sticks is not an official answer, but I would hope that you're trying to progress monitor. So screening, then following that up with progress monitoring, right? A screener tells you who to teach, but progress monitoring lets you dig a little deeper and maybe see what to teach. And then hopefully your school system has a multi-level prevention system, right? Your tier 1, your tier 2, your tier 3, it should be a committee. And of course, all of this is data-based decision-making, right? We have the initial screen, then we're going to continually monitor the progress and then work within that tiered system as a team for students.
And one thing I thought was interesting, Sharon Vaughn was at the Reading League conference just this last week, and she brought up some really interesting points about the MTSS model, as well as just instruction in general. And first of all, making sure that, as you say, after you've done the screening, you've chosen a really good for your program, a foundational evidence-based program, right? That's going to be what you use in order to help with reading, instructing, and then helping those who are having challenges with reading. And then beyond that, pay attention to the fact that we want to make sure those tiers talk to each other and share the same language, because we don't want our students who have the most challenge trying to figure this reading thing out, and they're having different language used in, say, tier 2 versus tier 3 than the classroom in terms of what does it mean to the syllable types, and we're making sure that we're talking the same language for those students, so that when they do get into a tier 1 situation that they might get stuck or something, a strategy could be shared by that homeroom teacher, whether they're teaching a different subject, could be 4th, 5th, 6th grade, but that teacher knows what to toss out as a strategy because they've had at least some exposure to the material that's being used to help students become better readers. So that was another thing to remember, to keep in mind, to make sure we're sharing.
Yeah, and just also remembering that the tiers are not a one-way street, right?
No.
That it is not a path to special education services. It's an accountability piece. So students should be moving up and down those tiers ideally.
Yeah. A way in which to receive appropriate dosaging, right? Just making sure we're
Right.
getting it across the board. So state dyslexia handbooks, they're important. Let's not forget them as a resource. Many, I think all the states now, don't we? I think we do. I mean, I used to keep track of it, and there were 2 that were lagging behind, but I'm hopeful that that probably happened within the last legislative years. But we have dyslexia handbooks. And if your state doesn't have one that you can find, you can Google and find really good state dyslexia handbooks. They're full of terrific information. What's nice about having one that's specific to your state is that you get really good guidance about the things you should say or can say as a teacher. Exactly what are we doing about screening in our state? These are all within these handbooks, so it's a good thing to check them out. I had the good opportunity and experience to be able to sit on our handbook committee for our state. And these are folks who put a lot of time into thinking about all that should be in that handbook. So it's useful resource for parents and for teachers and for students too, to provide information. And even though we're focusing in on those early grades, there's a lot of really good information for students as they get older, what opportunities are for them for reading. So make sure you pay attention to those. Now, fostering those supportive environments, this is really important, a big part of what we're talking about today. And for one, we want to make sure we lay this down very quickly because it seems to be a point that's challenging for a lot of educational spaces. An accommodation versus a modification, and they are different things. And I often see students receiving a great deal of modifications, a few accommodations, but they're getting a lot of modifications. And sometimes their parent, guardian doesn't understand what that means to receive that many modifications until the student has aged into high school, about to exit. And a lot of times those students haven't had the opportunity to write a complete paper They haven't had the opportunity to take a full test in a certain subject because they've made too many modifications, which is a change to what a student is taught or expected to learn. So that's that idea of, oh, well, you can do 1 page instead of 2 because it takes so long to get through it. That's okay at a certain point, but we want to keep an eye on that to make sure we're not over modifying and under accommodating. Oftentimes I see that. The accommodation changes how a student learns the material or completes that particular project. So the accommodation just helps the student. It scaffolds it for the student to be able to accomplish the same thing as everybody else in the class. I'll be doing that same level of work, but I might say, have a scribe. I can listen to the books, those sorts of things in order to get to the same information to end up with the same product in the end. A modification changes that, and make sure we understand the difference, because boy, can that be a game changer for a student who gets to be their junior year, senior year of high school, and they really wanted to do college. And because they've had all these modifications throughout, it's a huge leap to go to that next level to college. And it isn't until really you get there to that junior or senior year that oftentimes it's recognized that, oh my goodness, we haven't really scaffolded this student to do this type of work. So that's good.
Yeah, so an accommodation is the same curriculum.
Yep.
You're just accommodating them to meet those same expectations and curriculum, right? And it's really important because like you've said, and we've said last time, intelligence has nothing to do with dyslexia.
Yeah.
The last thing we want to do is really water down a knowledge-rich curriculum,
Yep.
right? That's doing a disservice for sure.
Yeah. And to get someone in the mode of not having expectation for him or herself, right? To be able to say, hey, look, I can do the 5-page. I remember my son with dyslexia advocating for himself in a classroom. And I heard him say, I can do 6 pages. Let me do the 6 pages. I thought that was really interesting that he's having to ask no, I can do that. I'm going to need, and then he lists some accommodations, but I can do the paper. So the students know they can do it too. So let's help them do that. Appropriate accommodations and modifications. So this is a K-5 classroom. Now that we've talked about the difference between each, you'll be able to recognize where these fit, right? In which category. So allow time to process information. That's an accommodation, not a modification. So I'm just allowing you some additional time. You're still going to have to do all the material. You're still going to access it, but I'm allowing you extra time to process that information. In the end, you'll still produce the same as everyone else, right? So that's an accommodation. Toss the red pen into the trash can. What do you think, Kristen?
I love it. I love it. It's not only is it I think it's vulgar. I always used a green or red pen, and it's, we talked about dyslexia having a genetic component too, right? And so it may be triggering for lack of, I know that's a buzzword, but it may be triggering for parents, who got a lot of these marked up papers coming home. And then, for their children to be bringing home these red ink bloody papers. It's just awful. So definitely toss that in the trash can. I also like the don't mark off for spelling. If you need to take a spelling grade, do that separately, but don't mark off for spelling in their writing, right? And I love the not requiring oral reading, right? Remember that popcorn reading, which is also triggering for people because nobody's comprehending. They're practicing what they have to read. So you wouldn't want to put anybody on the spot to do that when it's a challenging thing for them to do, at least without warning. I love the give less homework. I've been in elementary schools where we had a no homework policy because there's really not a lot of research in K-5 to support homework, pushing a child forward academically. It has very little, if any, impact on academic outcomes in K-5.
And the thing about spelling, because I have many teachers push back on this, because then they say, well, then how do they know how to spell correctly if you're unable to mark anything? And well, what if the sentences aren't constructed correctly? So leaning into what Kristen said about taking a separate grade for different things, but also additionally, and more importantly, make sure that that student who has challenges with spelling is receiving appropriate intervention. So let's take this even a step further and say, hey, if you're not certain that student's receiving appropriate intervention, track that down and make sure that's happening. And if it's not, let's see what we can do about it, because that is separate and apart from what you're going to be grading in class. You're going after content. You want to see if the student's really understanding the material. Are they able to make that known to you? Are they able to summarize, put it together? But if those skill sets that need intervention still need support, let's make sure that student's receiving appropriate. And then chat with the person who is providing the intervention to see what stage they're at within intervention. Is there a type of pattern for spelling that maybe in class you could reinforce? So you could be partners. Again, that's talking across the tiers, as Kristen and I both said. Huh?
And just choose your battles. Choose your
Yeah.
battles. You're an educator, choose your battles. Is it more important for them to have this content and get their thoughts on paper, or is it more important that they know this BAL team, right? And then the other thing before we change slides is not punishing, like withholding recess. In my state, I'm in Atlanta, so in Georgia, it's illegal to withhold recess. So think about, again, what you're trying to accomplish with your actions, right? Choosing your battles, what's necessary and what's not. And so just not punishing for work that's not complete, that's definitely not giving them something that they need.
And then appropriate accommodations and modifications in 6 through 12 classroom. So we've broken this up in written expression and homework. And under that written expression, Kristen, why don't you go ahead and talk about that one?
So yeah, providing alternatives to written reports. So letting them create, right? The big idea is creating. So whether it's a written piece that's created or something else that's created, but a video or mural maybe is how they show what they know, a class presentation, grading on content again, and not spelling. And then writing reports, team project, providing support, give explicit guidelines. Everything should be direct and explicit, all expectations, right? Whether it's a group project or something else, everything is direct, explicit. We're not committing a suicide, assuming that they know something that they don't. But I love the alternatives to written reports, right? And I think typically developing students should have these alternatives as well. Having some voice and choice is something that I like to talk about.
Yeah, we just want to make sure, and I think it is too great for the alternatives. Make sure, though, that that student is receiving the opportunities to get the skills that would be needed for college as well. So if everybody else at some point is writing the 4 to 5 to 6 page paper, make sure that every student receives that same opportunity to be prepared for college. We just want to make sure that happens. So make sure it's not always a video or it's not always a
Yes.
mural. Yeah, right?
Right.
And I remember my son, for one of his projects in a class, we negotiated because he was very creative, and it was for World War II. This is elementary school, and he ends up making a World War II style gun that stands on a tripod, and it actually feeds out of paper and masking tape. I kid you not. The thing was amazing, and it was right down to, had it down to the triggers in the right place, the bullets would feed through. You would pull this and through an elastic band. I tell you, it was something. It was a work of art. But he also did a little plaque that went with it to explain what it was to do a little bit of writing. That's a great compromise between those two things, but yet got to shine, right, on that thing he was able to do. Shorten those homework assignments. Parents can act as a timekeeper. So that's an accommodation too. Having timekeeping is an accommodation. It's not a modification. I still have to get this done, but somebody helping me to be able to pace myself. That's a great thing to have in place, and to help the student take that over, to have something to do it for them, either on their phone with some sort of timing device. That's a great skill to give. Notify parents immediately if the assignment is not turned in. That's just good teaching practice for any student, is to notify if it's not turned in, to make sure there's support going on. And then don't send home unfinished classroom work. Oh, that's just, you don't want a kiddo taking that home. That's a lot. Shorten those classroom assignments. As we said, that whole thing about homework, the research, a lot of it's saying it's not all that helpful. And be consistent when assigning and collecting homework. Again, that's just good practice, so students can anticipate when that should be and be able to plan for it. It's really good. Now,
yeah, I love to. Oh, I'm sorry, Donna.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that I love to, now that we have so many online grade books. I know personally with my children, I get little pings when things are graded and turned in, so I can see it
Great.
almost in real time, which is awesome.
Yep. Fantastic. So accommodations and support with technology. This is just a not a comprehensive list, but a list of some, and there are a lot of accommodation and support with technology. So the name of the game here is make sure you explore and make sure you update, because they change quite rapidly and you have really good ones. I didn't put AI here because that's controversial for some folks, but trust me, my students are using it in many different ways, and it's very interesting how they use that. And it's oftentimes an editor for them, support. It doesn't do everything because my students still need to know what it is. And if you help students approach a tech like that, then you get much better results. Students don't rely on it too heavily. Instead, it's a support. It helps them feel more confident about what they produce. So Learning Ally, we're quite familiar with that one. This one, you need to have either an IEP or someone from a school who says that you do have a difficulty with reading, and then you can get onto this one. And it's a very small fee for what you receive. And it's most every book I've ever looked for. And it's a text with a voice, and it's human read, which is fantastic. And then there's Bookshare, another form of the same thing. Grammarly, we talked about that grammar. In fact, I know some adults in the workspace who need to get emails done who have dyslexia, and they pay for an upgrade of Grammarly, and that does the trick for them. They love it. Said I wouldn't send an email without it. So Grammarly, Microsoft Reading Coach app. If you haven't checked this out, this is a good one. Yeah. Check it out, because that's the fluency piece that we're talking about, opportunities to practice and receive feedback. So again, these are just going to become even better and better through the years.
Yeah,
No
and
red
with that,
ink.
with that Microsoft Reading Coach app, you can actually, teachers can upload passages too. And then here, so it can be any text at all. It's really neat. If you're a Microsoft school or you have access to that, it's great.
Fantastic. And they're usually pretty reasonable, Kristen, too, about giving resources. Microsoft is, especially in the education space. No red ink. So that's another one we were talking about with making sure that you're not being too heavy on the grammar and yet still having opportunities to weigh in on what students are doing. Snap Type. This is a homework app where for those kiddos who just, the handwriting dysgraphia is so difficult, you can take a picture of the homework and it can actually be done on a screen and then given to the teacher. And then Drive with speech to text. If you haven't checked out Google Drive with their speech to text, it just gets better and better. I recommend it to students. It's free. It's right there in Google Drive, and they can use it. Again, have an outline or something and let the students kind of work with it. It takes practice. So if a student tries it out once and they've gone in cold without an outline for what they want to write, it's not going to be a great experience. You're going to want to have some opportunities with it. Speak It. This takes text and puts it to speech, which is great. So it does that as well. Mercury Reader is one that a lot of people are unfamiliar with, but I think it's fantastic, particularly if you have a combination of maybe some ADHD along with your dyslexia, so you get readily distracted. Mercury Reader takes any online page, and if you have it in your browser, it'll clean it up and take all of the extraneous material out and have text for you. So you're not bogged down looking around at things. Instead, it's text for you, and then you can also have it read if you want to. You can put it in through another one and do text to speech. So these are just some great supports. Again, not even the tip of the iceberg, right? About what's available.
Yeah, and a lot of times whatever you adopt, whatever's in a school may have some of these digital options as well. I use Grammarly all the time, even without dyslexia. I'm like,
Right?
"Oh, I messed up on that."
Absolutely. Who wouldn't want an editor right there?
Right.
So we just want to make you aware that we have some podcasts out with Reading Horizons. It's called Dyslexia Talks. And one of them is my husband's story. And if you have an opportunity to listen, if you have somebody in your life that maybe has struggled with reading, hasn't really felt heard or understood, this podcast is probably a really good one for them. It's my husband's story. To me, it was a little bit of a tearjerker. So have a hanky handy. I'm just going to warn you. And then we also have some great information from an individual who runs the Disability Resource Center for a university and talks about how students need to be prepared when they come to the university and those different things. She talks a lot about accommodation modification too. It's an interesting conversation. Anyway, those are available, Dyslexia Talks, if you're interested. And we have come to the end, resources that we've got there. And we have a challenge. Jillian, take it away. If we have.
Hi, so thank you both so much. This has been incredible, and I'm just so thankful for all the accommodations that you offered us. I am wanting to welcome you all to take the Dyslexia Awareness Challenge in the Science of Reading Collective. So the Science of Reading Collective is our platform where we get together in community to learn and grow and together eradicate illiteracy. So if you use this QR code, it will take you to the Dyslexia Awareness Challenge. That is where we are going to share these videos. And then there is a space for you to do today's challenge, which is share a takeaway in the Spaces feed and then test your knowledge. So there is a 5-question multi-choice quiz that is in there all about today and couple weeks ago, the part 1 presentation. So test your knowledge. Nobody's going to see your scores or result. You can take it again if needed. It's all confidential. And then the last thing is share it with a friend. So I was telling Donell and Kristen earlier today that, it's shocking that this information is not more widely known. So please share this with your colleagues, get it out so that we can really best support our students with dyslexia. Okay, it is 10:02. Kristen, I think you might need to hop off, but we do have some questions. So Donell, if you can stay, is that right?
Yeah, so thank you for letting me be a part of this. My 5th grader is singing in a performance tonight. It's going to be stellar, I'm sure.
It will.
But thank you for letting me be a part of this, and I know you're in great hands with Donell answering questions.
Thanks,
Thank you
Kristen.
so much for your time. All right, so Donell, we're going to move quickly because I know we don't have a ton of time here, but there were a few questions that came in the Q&A section that asked if you could kind of explain the difference between silent sustained reading and independent reading instruction.
Yeah, so independent reading instruction, and again, this is generalized definition. So you might have a space that you're working in where people have adopted maybe a different definition of it. So make sure you have understanding within the building if you're working with other educators that you all know, hey, is this what you're thinking about, the same thing? Because I've seen that in different spaces and in schools. But when you're doing the silent sustained reading, that's really when a student, you are confident that the student is able to read at that level. So you've done your work with that student, you've been through many different reads, maybe they've had remediation for a period of time, and you're confident that this particular level of reading, that student has the skills. And so that would be that silent sustained reading when a student is able to do that. Because guess what? We have to do that when we're in a testing situation. You may have an accommodation where some of it's read to you, but a lot of students like to have some capacity to do some of that sustained silent reading if they need to. And so we want to have our students have an opportunity to do that. And then the other one with the independent. So Jillian, I just want to make sure I've got it correctly, right? The independent is what they're calling it? Yeah.
Yep, the independent reading instruction.
Yeah, independent reading instruction is what it says. So independently, you're going to give me some instruction about what will occur with this read, and independently, I will do that. But you're monitoring, you're closely monitoring. So either I've got an ear out, you have a read partner, maybe the two of you are sharing, but you've got a set of goals or things that I've given you to do. That's typically the general understanding. Again, make sure if you're in a school setting where you're using different types of techniques that you all have a shared understanding of those terms. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And then the other term that came up was oral assisted reading. Does that fall into those two categories or is that its own thing?
Yeah, so oral assisted reading, and again, make sure that we're all on the same page with how we're thinking about these things. But that's a term oftentimes people refer to as an oral assisted read, as it's out loud. So you're giving the read out loud and it's receiving assistance. So sometimes that text is just a little bit of a step up for a student, it is. And so an oral assisted read is an opportunity to hear while the student is reading out loud to see, is the student able to reach that level? Because again, we always want to make sure that we're not keeping students, we're not holding them back, we're giving them opportunities. So we should be thinking about text in right at my just right level, text that's a little bit below where my right at level is so I can just breeze through that text, and text that's just a step or above we're having these different opportunities with text because that's reality, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Another one came in that said, are there some states that are exemplars in dyslexia handbooks?
Oh, this is where you name names, right? You get a chance to name names. There's one, I'm just going to say, they had the opportunity to have Dr. Louisa Moats weigh in early with how they put theirs together, and that's Texas. But again, remember, Texas is pretty unique because they also have a lot of dyslexia supports that other states don't have. So you'll find that in the handbook. You may even have a moment where you wipe a tear away because you think, boy, wouldn't that be great if we had dyslexia specialists everywhere. So you'll see things within that handbook maybe that you would dream of being in your state, but it's a really good, solid handbook. And we've revised ours in our state. It'll be coming out again. And we had Dr. Nancy Mather and Dr. Louisa Moats weigh in on it. They were so generous, and others as well. So again, they're not that different from each other, and they shouldn't be, because, right, we have a pattern of how we know how to support. So you shouldn't be seeing them be that dramatic. But I know Texas, they were early and they've updated, and they had some great input early on in theirs. But Connecticut has a good one too, different states. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, the next question is, do you ever run into an issue where all the students would prefer the alternative to a written report? How do you balance that and make sure that you don't demotivate other students or cause peers to feel like you are playing favorites?
Yeah. Oh, this is a good one. And you want to also so the question would also be, what grade am I teaching? So you know that there are certain sort of milestones that a student needs to meet at certain grades. So I used to teach them high school English, and there were certain, because of the core standards, and then we also had state standards, and now we follow those in different states. You want to make sure that your student's meeting some of those standards. So that's where that balance comes in. We love having students have choice and opportunity, but there's only so much choice and opportunity within standards, right? That's going on. And you want to make sure that if that ninth grade student has had an opportunity in which to, if the standard says write a type of report, has to be so many pages and you have to do these various things, annotate specific, then you're going to want to make sure they've had an opportunity to do that. That being said, there are other opportunities, like say we've done a book read, and midway through that book read, we may have opportunities to demonstrate what we've been learning about the material and the connections we've been making by offering some different choices midway through that would prepare the student, because it gets them thinking about what they've been learning, maybe character development, story development, and setting that could be different from just writing a report. But then we end up at the end of the novel, it will end up in a report. But that alternative has given the student a chance to put together the thoughts and ideas that will be feeding into that end report. Those are some that I really like to do, where throughout a project or something, and usually it's around a book, because I taught English, that you would give them opportunities in those chapters before you get to the end, where it culminates in something where it looks more like a paper that they would produce, because that's where they're headed really in college. Don't tell the kids that. It's going to be a paper.
Okay, I think we have time for just a couple more. One, I can answer this one. This came in the chat. It said, where can I find part 1 of this lecture? I missed that. So the QR code on the screen right now is to the dyslexia awareness space held within the Science of Reading Collective. In that space is the recording from video 1. It also has the challenge for our video 1, which was to share in the feed a takeaway. And then we're also going to be sharing the slides from today and part 1. So that will all be in the Science of Reading Collective. So use that QR code and you can find it all there. Okay, moving on. It says, what is your favorite scientific peer-reviewed journals on the Science of Reading evidence-based literacy practices?
Boy, there's so many now. That's the thing, is that we're spoiled for choice. Back in the day, you couldn't have a whole lot of choices. But the Reading League does a fantastic journal that they put out. I think it's really good, particularly for teachers, because it's very teacher friendly. And they balance that out with a fair amount of, yes, this is basic research in the field, but then also practices in the classroom, which I think is really great to find. So that's the Reading League journal. And then also perspectives from the International Dyslexia Association is one that's been around a long time and is thought of highly. And it's also where you can gain a lot of information and resources. That all being said, if you have access to some of these ResearchNet, there are papers all the time that are being produced. The Scientific Study of Reading, that Society for the Scientific Study of Reading, they put out some great information, and your big reading researchers are involved with them as well. Those are just a few.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I think we can squeeze in one more and then we will wrap it up. This one is a little bit shifting gears here. It says, when a student is listening to read or listening to an audiobook,
Mhm.
are they also supposed to be looking at the text or just reading?
Okay, so that's a super good question. And it falls into that category of the different type of reading experiences we talked about at the first of the questions, right? These are all really good questions, and they fall into that category of scaffolding, supporting the overlying skill and the underlying skill. And so here, I'm going to say there's a few ways we can approach this. You want to get a student used to, because here's the reality, and here's what I look at because I work with students across the trajectory of their education into college. I work with scholarship recipients who have dyslexia too. And the reality is that students will be asked to do a great deal of reading when they get older. So if you're preparing a young student to be ready for, hey, I'd like to go on and do a course, I'd like to maybe go to college, or I'd like to do some coursework, that's going to require information. Information, I am sorry to say, but until it's different, it's reading. That's what it is. And we can support that by having it read to the student. And you want to get them used to following along with text, particularly when it's academic reading, or even with a book that you're going to be asking questions about later, say in an English class where they may have to pull out quotes. The reason, directionality and being able to get perspective and orientation to the page. That is a thing. It's a thing we know about. Marianne Wolf has written about this as well. Microsoft knows it well. That's why they've kept a stylus, and they also have pages that look like real book pages, is because our memory and ability to find something after we have read it is connected to where it is on the page, on the physical page. This is a thing. And so we do want to get students used to that, particularly if we know they have to come back to that information and access it. Now, that being said, let students also have fun and enjoy listening to a great novel where if, you know what, I don't really want to follow along, but I could get lost in that novel and maybe I'll work on this while I listen. Students can do that and they can enjoy a great range. That's different. I'm enjoying myself. I'm having a great listen. But if I want you to be able to access that information later and use it and pull it out, then orientation is going to be important. Yeah.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Donell, and thank you to all of you who are joining us live right now and who were here for the presentation. Don't forget to join us in the Science of Reading Collective in the Dyslexic Challenge. After you've completed the challenge, then you earn your own dyslexia awareness badge that you can probably display in the space. We are so thankful for you here at Reading Horizons. I don't know, I think there's a question, but I can't even remember what's on the very last slide, Donell, and I think you are the one moving it, but
Oh yeah, questions.
yeah,
And thank you for
just
attending.
so thank you for attending. So we will see you soon. And yeah, Donell, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night. Sorry, we went 2 minutes late. Take care. Bye, everyone.